And that, my dear, is how we're securing our future.
Excellent news, Mr. Peterson. Everything is in order. You signed the house?
Look closely, dear. It's all right there in black and white.
No, I would never do that. I don't remember this.
You signed it. It's all perfectly legal.
The vault determines legal authority here.
We just want our savings. You can't deny us. Oh my God!
It can't be.
The day. My husband smiled at the bank manager and said, "My wife gave everything away." Years ago, I felt something inside me break. Richard spoke with such confidence that even I questioned my own memory. He insisted I no longer owned my late mother's heirlooms, our family investments, or even the contents of the old bank vault. Then the manager quietly looked at both of us and said, "The vault will determine who has legal authority." As the massive steel door slowly swung open, Richard's smile disappeared, and I realized the truth had been waiting there much longer than either of us. If this story touches your heart, I'd truly appreciate it if you'd like and subscribe. And before we continue, tell me in the comments, have you ever trusted someone completely only to discover they were hiding the truth? Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I always love reading your messages. My name is Virginia Coleman, and when everything happened, I was 63 years old. For most of my life, I believed I had been one of the lucky ones. I had spent 34 years working as an elementary school librarian in Columbus, Ohio. Every weekday, I unlocked the library doors before the children arrived. I knew which students secretly loved mysteries, which ones hid in the history section when they were upset, and which little faces would light up whenever a new shipment of books came in. Books made sense to me, people, not always. After retiring, I imagined life would become quieter. I pictured mornings with coffee on the back porch, afternoons, tending the flower beds my mother had helped me plant years earlier, and weekends visiting our daughter Emily and her family. It sounded like the perfect reward after decades of working. Instead, retirement slowly became something I hardly recognized. My husband Richard Coleman and I had been married for 38 years. When I first met him, he was kind in all the small ways that mattered. He remembered birthdays without reminders. He carried groceries without being asked. When my father became ill, Richard drove him to every doctor's appointment while I was still working. Everyone admired him, including me. People often told us we were the kind of couple they hoped to become someday. Looking back now, I realize memories can be honest without telling the whole truth. Somewhere along the way, Richard changed. Or perhaps he simply stopped hiding who he had always been. The change wasn't dramatic enough to notice in a single day. It arrived one small decision at a time. "I'll pay the bills," he said one evening. "You've worked all day, let me handle it." It sounded thoughtful, so I thanked him. Months later, he suggested we combine all our accounts into one place. "It'll be easier for taxes." That sounded reasonable too. Then he began organizing every insurance policy, every investment statement, every retirement account. Whenever mail arrived, he picked it up before I did. Whenever paperwork appeared, it somehow ended up on his desk first. I told myself he was simply better at finances than I was. To be honest, numbers had never been my strength. I trusted stories more than spreadsheets. Richard knew that. Whenever I apologized for not understanding financial terms, he would smile. "That's why you have me." At the time, those words made me feel safe. Years later, I would hear them differently. By the time I retired, I rarely saw our monthly statements. If I asked how our investments were doing, Richard always answered confidently, "We're fine. We're ahead. I already handled it." There was never a reason to worry. At least that's what I believed. Our daughter Emily noticed the changes long before I did. Emily was 36, a forensic accountant in Cincinnati. Unlike me, she questioned everything. She inherited that from my mother. One Sunday afternoon, after Richard stepped outside to answer a phone call, Emily quietly leaned toward me. "Mom, what? Do you actually know where all your accounts are?" I laughed. "Of course." She tilted her head. "Really? The smile faded from my face. I mean, Richard keeps track of them. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stirred her iced tea. You've always handled your own life. I know. So why doesn't Dad let you see anything anymore? I frowned. He lets me. Does he? The question stayed with me long after she drove home. That evening, I casually asked Richard if we could look over our retirement investments together. He chuckled. Virginia, you've never enjoyed that stuff. I know. So why stress yourself now? I was just curious. He kissed my forehead. Everything's under control. It sounded affectionate. Looking back, it also ended the conversation. Little by little, that became his pattern. Questions disappeared beneath reassurance. Not arguments, not anger, just gentle dismissal. Months passed. Life continued. Then my mother died. Eleanor Brooks was 87. She had lived independently until the very end. She believed in handwritten letters, fresh biscuits, Sunday dinners, and keeping promises. She had never trusted computers. She still balanced her checkbook with a pencil. She also believed every woman should understand her own finances. When I was younger, she'd often tell me, money isn't about being rich, it's about never needing permission. I smiled whenever she said it. I didn't realize how important those words would become. Losing her felt like losing the last person who always knew exactly who I was. The funeral was quiet, just family, old neighbors, church friends. Richard stood beside me the entire day holding my hand whenever another person offered condolences. Everyone commented on what a devoted husband he was. I agreed. At the cemetery, Emily wrapped her arm around my shoulders. We'll get through this. I know. I'll help with Grandma's estate. Before I could answer, Richard spoke. I've already contacted the probate attorney. Emily looked surprised. So quickly. The sooner everything's organized, the easier it'll be for your mother. Again, it sounded reasonable. Nobody questioned it. Least of all me. Within days, Richard had collected every folder from my mother's house. Tax records, property files, insurance documents, investment statements, family records. He stacked everything neatly inside his home office. I'll organize it. You don't have to do all that yourself, I said. I want to. He smiled. You should focus on grieving. It sounded loving. It sounded supportive. It sounded exactly like the man I'd spent nearly 4 decades trusting. Except something small caught my attention. Whenever I entered his office unexpectedly, he'd quickly close whichever folder he had been reading. The first time I ignored it. The second time I assumed he was protecting my privacy. The third time, I noticed he had installed a lock on the office door. That lock had never been there before. When I asked about it, he answered without looking up. Some of these papers are important. I nodded. They're my mother's papers. I know. So why lock them away from me? For just a second, Richard froze, only for a heartbeat. Then he smiled again. I don't want anything getting misplaced. It was such an ordinary explanation. Yet something deep inside me whispered that it wasn't the whole truth. For the first time in 38 years of marriage, I walked away from a conversation with my husband carrying something I had never carried before. Not anger, not fear, just a quiet, uncomfortable feeling that perhaps I no longer knew the man I had built my entire life beside. And although I tried to ignore that feeling, it refused to leave. Instead, it settled silently beside me, waiting. The lock on Richard's office door should have been a small thing. Most people probably wouldn't have thought twice about it. I tried not to. After all, grief changes people. Losing my mother had left both of us emotionally exhausted, and perhaps Richard simply wanted a quiet place to organize paperwork without interruptions. That explanation sounded reasonable enough that I repeated it to myself every time I walked past the closed door. Still, every explanation has a limit. Mine reached its limit about 3 weeks after the funeral. I came home from grocery shopping earlier than expected. Richard's car was in the driveway, so I assumed he was still inside. As I carried the bags through the kitchen, I heard voices coming from his office. One voice belonged to Richard. The other belonged to a man I didn't recognize. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. In fact, I intended to announce that I was home. But before I could speak, I heard Richard say something that made me stop walking. She doesn't understand any of this. The stranger chuckled softly. Then keeping things simple is best, Richard replied without hesitation. Exactly. I waited for another sentence, hoping I had misunderstood the context. Instead, I heard papers sliding across a desk. Once these are signed, the stranger said, there shouldn't be any complications, Richard answered quietly. There won't be. I suddenly felt like an outsider standing in my own hallway. I deliberately made enough noise setting the grocery bags on the counter that they would know I had arrived. A second later, the office door opened. Richard smiled so naturally that I almost questioned what I had heard. Oh, sweetheart, you're home early. I guess I am. He introduced the visitor. This is Mark Jensen. Mark extended his hand. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Coleman. His handshake was firm but brief. What do you do, Mr. Jensen? I asked. Before he could answer, Richard spoke. He helps organize estate paperwork. Something about that answer felt incomplete. Not dishonest, just incomplete. Mark smiled politely. Your husband has done an excellent job staying ahead of everything. I thanked him, although I wasn't entirely sure why. He left only a few minutes later. After his car disappeared down the street, I walked into the office. The folders that had been spread across the desk moments earlier were gone. Every drawer was closed. Every cabinet was locked. Only 2 coffee cups remained. You've been busy, I said. Richard nodded. I want to finish the probate process as quickly as possible. I didn't realize we needed outside help. It's complicated. I looked around the room. Can I see the paperwork? He smiled again. I already filed most of it. So there's nothing left. Nothing you need to worry about. That sentence stayed with me. Nothing you need to worry about. When had concern become something I wasn't allowed to have? A few days later, Richard walked into the living room carrying a thick stack of papers. I need your signature. I glanced at the first page. What is it? Routine probate documents. I'd like to read them. He laughed, not cruelly, but almost affectionately. Virginia, there are nearly 60 pages. I still want to read them. You'll be here all afternoon. I don't mind. For the first time, I noticed genuine impatience cross his face. It isn't necessary. I'd still like to. He sighed dramatically before handing me the packet. I settled into my favorite chair and began reading. The first several pages looked exactly as he had described. Inventory forms, tax summaries, property descriptions. Nothing unusual. Then I reached a page filled with legal language I didn't understand. What does this section mean? Richard barely looked up from his phone. It authorizes administrative transfers. Administrative transfers. It just allows the attorney to process paperwork. So nothing changes. Exactly. I nodded and kept reading. 5 minutes later, another paragraph confused me. What about this? It's standard. And this one, also standard. Eventually, I noticed something strange. The signature line wasn't labeled probate authorization. Instead, it referenced something called a comprehensive asset distribution acknowledgement. I've never heard of that. You don't need to. I'd like an explanation. Richard walked over, took the document gently from my hands, and pointed to a paragraph halfway down the page. It's legal wording. It says distribution. Exactly. Distribution to whom? The estate. Which estate? He smiled patiently as though speaking to a child. Virginia. It's just legal terminology. I hated how quickly embarrassment replaced curiosity. I suppose lawyers always make things complicated. They certainly do. He handed me a pen. I hesitated, only for a second. Then I signed. Looking back now, I don't blame that moment on stupidity. I blame it on trust. When you've shared nearly 4 decades with someone, you stop expecting every document to hide a trap. Trust changes how carefully you read. Over the next month, more documents appeared. Some arrived after dinner, some before breakfast, some while I was watering flowers in the backyard. Richard always seemed to know exactly when I was least prepared to ask questions. Just one signature. This one too. Almost done. He never rushed me aggressively. Instead, he used familiarity, routine, normalcy. Eventually, signing became automatic. One evening, Emily stopped by unexpectedly. She had driven from Cincinnati after finishing an audit. As always, she hugged me first, then she hugged Richard. While he grilled hamburgers outside, Emily wandered into the kitchen. She noticed several documents lying beside my purse. "What's all this estate paperwork?" She picked up the top page. Within seconds, her expression changed. "Mom, what? Did you read these?" "I tried." "What do you mean you tried? The language is confusing." She scanned another page. "This isn't just probate paperwork. It isn't." She looked directly into my eyes. "Some of these forms appear to acknowledge transfers of ownership." I blinked. "Transfers. That's what this wording suggests." Richard walked back inside, carrying a plate of grilled corn. "What are you two talking about?" Emily didn't hesitate. "These documents. They're standard. I'd like to know which attorney prepared them." Richard set the plate on the counter. "Our attorney." "Which one?" "I hired someone after Mr. Wallace retired." Emily frowned. "You replaced Mom's attorney." "He retired." "I know. Why didn't Mom choose the replacement herself?" Richard folded his arms. "I was helping." Emily carefully placed the documents back on the counter. "I think Mom should have independent legal advice." Silence filled the kitchen. Richard finally laughed. "Emily, you're seeing problems that don't exist." She didn't laugh. "I'm a forensic accountant. I review financial documents every day. I know unusual wording when I see it." Richard's smile became noticeably tighter. "You don't trust me," Emily answered calmly. "This isn't about trust. It's about transparency." For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, I stepped between them. "I appreciate both of you. I'm sure everything is fine." Emily looked at me with unmistakable sadness. "Mom, if everything is fine, then another attorney will say exactly the same thing." Richard immediately answered, "That won't be necessary." The speed of his response surprised all three of us, even him. He recovered quickly. Hiring another attorney would only waste money." Emily quietly picked up her purse. "I should get going." After she left, Richard stood at the front window watching her car disappear. Then he turned toward me. "Your daughter has always been suspicious. She's only trying to protect me." "I've been protecting you for 38 years. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was controlled, almost rehearsed. Then he said something I wouldn't fully understand until much later. "Sometimes the people who ask the most questions are the ones planning to take what's yours." At the time, I assumed he was talking about lawyers. I never imagined. He was preparing me to distrust the only person who was trying to save me. For the next several weeks, life settled into something that looked ordinary from the outside. I watered my roses every morning. I attended church every Sunday. Emily called every Wednesday evening, never failing to ask the same question. "How are you doing, Mom?" "I'm fine." "And Dad?" "He's busy with the estate." There was always a short pause after I mentioned the estate. Emily never criticized Richard directly anymore. She had learned that every warning she offered only made me defend him more fiercely. Instead, she asked different questions. "Have you seen the final inventory?" "No." "Have you met the new attorney again?" "No." "Have you received copies of everything you've signed?" "I don't think so." Each answer made the silence on the other end of the phone a little longer. One afternoon, she finally said something that unsettled me. "Mom, if Grandma left you something important, I want to make sure it's still yours." "It is." "How do you know?" I opened my mouth to answer. Nothing came out. Because the truth was, I didn't know. That realization lingered with me long after we hung up. The following Monday, Richard invited me to lunch. We drove to a small restaurant overlooking the Scioto River, one of our favorite places since retirement. The waitress recognized us immediately and seated us by the window. For a little while, everything felt normal again. We talked about the weather, about Emily's work, about our grandson Ethan starting high school. I almost convinced myself the tension of the past few weeks had existed only in my imagination. Then Richard folded his napkin carefully and looked across the table. "I've finished settling your mother's estate." I smiled sadly. "I'm glad that's behind us." "So am I." He reached into his leather briefcase and removed a thick envelope. "I've brought copies of the final paperwork." "Thank you." I reached for the envelope. Instead of handing it to me, he kept his hand resting on top of it. "There's one more thing." "What is it?" "I think we should simplify our finances." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "You don't need to worry about individual ownership anymore. We're married. Everything is already ours together." His tone remained calm, measured, almost rehearsed. "I've transferred everything into a structure that's much easier to manage." "What exactly is everything?" "Our investments. Our savings. Some inherited property. My mother's property. Our property now." The word "our" landed differently than it ever had before. My mother's belongings weren't ours. They are now. I stared at him. "I don't remember agreeing to that." "You signed the documents." My stomach tightened. "I signed probate papers." "You signed everything that was necessary." The waitress appeared with our meals. Neither of us touched them. I lowered my voice. "Richard, can I see exactly what I signed?" He gently pushed the envelope toward me. "It's all in there." Back home, I carried the envelope into the living room. For the next 3 hours, I read every page. Most of it looked familiar. Tax summaries, estate inventories, bank correspondence. Then, buried nearly halfway through the stack, I found something that made my heartbeat quicken. The heading read, "Voluntary Transfer of Personal Interest." I read it once, then again. According to the document, I had voluntarily transferred ownership interests in several inherited assets. There was my signature. Or what looked like my signature. I couldn't remember signing it. Maybe I had. Maybe I hadn't. I honestly didn't know anymore. The uncertainty frightened me more than certainty ever could have. Richard walked into the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You've been reading for a while." I held up the document. "What is this?" He barely glanced at it. "I explained that weeks ago." "I don't remember." "You signed it." "I know I signed something." "I don't remember agreeing to give away ownership." He set the coffee on the table. "You didn't give it away. You transferred it. To us. That's different." "No, Richard. It isn't." His expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "It protects our future. My mother wanted those things to stay in the family. They are. They're with family." The conversation left me exhausted. Not because he raised his voice. He never did. But because every answer somehow made me question my own memory instead of his explanation. A few days later, my cousin Linda invited several relatives to dinner. It was the first extended family gathering since my mother's funeral. Everyone hugged, shared old stories, laughed about childhood memories. For an hour, it felt comforting. Then my Uncle George casually asked, "Virginia, have you decided what you'll do with your mother's jewelry collection?" I smiled politely. "I haven't really thought about it." Richard answered before I could continue. "She already distributed everything." The room became quiet. Linda blinked. "Everything." Richard nodded confidently. "Virginia decided it would be easier." I turned toward him. "I did?" He looked surprised by my reaction. "Of course. You signed all the transfers." Several relatives exchanged confused glances. My Aunt Carol spoke carefully. "I thought Eleanor wanted those pieces kept in the family." "They are," Richard replied. "They've already been allocated." Allocated. The word sounded cold, businesslike, nothing like the way my mother had spoken about her belongings. George looked at me. "So who has Grandma's wedding necklace?" I hesitated. I don't know." The silence that followed was unbearable. Richard answered smoothly. "The paperwork has all that information." No one said another word. But I noticed something changing around the table. People weren't looking at Richard anymore. They were looking at me. Some with confusion, others with disappointment, as if I had casually disposed of generations of family history. The drive home was painfully quiet. Finally, I whispered, "Why did you answer for me? You seemed uncomfortable." "I was. You looked confused." "I was confused." He sighed. "Virginia, you've been overwhelmed. I've simply helped you through a difficult time." His words sounded caring, yet somehow they made me feel smaller, like someone who could no longer be trusted to speak for herself. The following morning, I decided to organize my own filing cabinet. If nothing else, I wanted copies of every important document in one place. Inside the cabinet were folders dating back nearly 20 years: insurance policies, retirement statements, tax returns, home maintenance records. Everything was neatly labeled, until I reached the section marked Eleanor Brooks Estate. The folder was empty, completely empty. At first, I assumed I had misplaced the contents. I searched every drawer, every shelf, every storage box. Nothing. Then I noticed something else. Several neighboring folders had obviously been removed and replaced. The tabs matched. The paper inside did not. Someone had reorganized the cabinet recently. Someone who knew exactly which documents belonged there. Richard. When he returned home that evening, I held the empty folder in my hands. "Have you seen these papers?" He glanced at the folder for less than a second. "I moved them." "Where?" "My office." "Why?" "So everything would stay together." "I'd like them back." "You don't need them." "I do." "For what?" "They belong to my mother." He walked past me toward the kitchen. "I'll find them later." "When?" "I'm busy tonight." "Richard." He stopped without turning around. "They're safe." That should have reassured me. Instead, for the first time since my mother's death, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The documents that could tell me the truth about my own inheritance were no longer in my possession, and the only person who knew exactly where they had gone was my husband. I barely slept that night. The empty estate folder remained on my bedside table long after Richard had fallen asleep beside me. Every time I looked at it, I felt as though it were accusing me of something, not of being careless, but of ignoring warning signs that had been quietly appearing for months. The house itself seemed different now. It was the same two-story colonial where Richard and I had lived for nearly 25 years. The hardwood floors still creaked near the staircase. The grandfather clock in the hallway still chimed every hour. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon because I baked bread every Saturday morning. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt unfamiliar. I kept asking myself one question. When had I stopped feeling at home inside my own life? The next morning, Richard left early for what he described as another meeting with the attorney. He kissed my forehead before leaving. "I won't be home until late." "Take your time," I answered. As soon as his car disappeared around the corner, I picked up my phone. "Emily," she answered on the second ring. "Mom, are you working today? I can leave if you need me." "No. I think I'd like some company." There was a brief silence. "I'll be there in an hour." Emily arrived carrying 2 coffees and the worried expression she had worn ever since Grandma Eleanor's funeral. She hugged me tightly before saying a word. "You look exhausted." "I feel exhausted." We sat at the kitchen table. Without speaking, I pushed the empty estate folder toward her. She opened it, then looked inside again. "There's nothing here." "I know." "Weren't Grandma's original records supposed to be in this folder?" "Yes." "What did Dad say?" "He moved them." "Where?" "His office." Emily slowly leaned back in her chair. "Did he give them back?" "No." She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she reached across the table and gently placed her hand over mine. "Mom, I need you to answer something honestly." "I will." "When was the last time you personally saw the original documents?" I searched my memory. I don't remember." "Before the funeral?" "Maybe. Shortly after." "I'm honestly not sure." Emily nodded slowly. "That's exactly what worries me." I looked down at my hands. "I keep wondering if I'm forgetting things." She shook her head. "No. You've been relying on someone else's memory instead of your own." Her words stung because they were true. For years, Richard had remembered every password, every account number, every appointment, every legal detail. I had slowly allowed my own confidence to disappear, not because I was incapable, because someone else always insisted he knew better. Emily finally asked the question neither of us wanted to say aloud. Mom, do you trust Dad? The answer should have come instantly. Instead, I hesitated. I want to. She nodded sadly. I know. Neither of us realized that hesitation would become the beginning of everything. After Emily left, I decided to clean the attic. It wasn't a planned decision. I simply needed something ordinary to do. Something that reminded me life still made sense. The attic had become a storage place for decades of memories. Old Christmas decorations, photo albums, boxes of school projects Emily had made as a child, my mother's sewing basket, my father's military uniforms. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight as I opened one box after another. For nearly 2 hours, I found nothing except memories. Then behind an old cedar chest, I noticed a small cardboard box I didn't recognize. It wasn't labeled. The tape had yellowed with age. Inside were dozens of photographs. Most showed my parents during their younger years. Family vacations, birthday parties, church picnics. Near the bottom lay a faded blue envelope. Across the front, written in my mother's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 simple words. For Virginia. Open only if necessary. My heart nearly stopped. The envelope had never been sealed. Perhaps she had intended to tell me about it. Perhaps she had forgotten. With trembling hands, I unfolded the letter inside. My dearest Virginia, if you are reading this, something has happened that prevented me from explaining everything in person. I pray I was simply being overly cautious. But if I was right, you will eventually need to know why I made certain decisions. You have always believed the best about people. That is one of the reasons I admire you. It is also the reason I worry about you. I smiled through tears. That sounded exactly like my mother. The letter continued. Some things cannot be protected by trust alone. Important family records should never depend upon copies. Only originals tell the complete truth. Years ago, I arranged for every essential document to be stored somewhere no one could quietly replace them. If confusion ever surrounds my estate, do not argue, do not panic. Go to First National Bank. Ask only about vault number 3117. Everything you need is already waiting there. My hands began shaking harder. Vault number 3117. I had never heard those words before, or had I something stirred deep inside my memory. A Christmas nearly 15 years earlier. My mother laughing as she placed a small brass key back into her purse. She had smiled and said, "Some things belong where only honesty can reach them." At the time, I assumed she was talking about jewelry. Now I wasn't so sure. I continued reading. Richard believes organization is the same as control. Those are not the same thing. If he has remained the man I hoped he would always be, this letter will never be necessary. But if he has not, trust the originals, not the copies. Truth survives longer than signatures. Love always, Mother. I stared at the page for several minutes. The house felt unnaturally quiet. The only sound was the grandfather clock downstairs marking another passing hour. I read the letter again, then a third time. One sentence refused to leave my mind. Trust the originals, not the copies. Suddenly, dozens of small moments from the past several months rearranged themselves inside my head. The locked office, the missing folders, the hurried signatures, the replacement attorney. Richard answering questions meant for me. The way he always insisted everything had already been handled. None of those moments proved wrongdoing. But together, they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. I reached into the envelope once more. A small folded slip of paper fell onto my lap. Unlike the letter, it contained only 2 handwritten lines. Vault 300 Semsin, present identification only. Do not notify anyone beforehand. No explanation, no signature, just instructions. I looked toward the front window. Richard wouldn't be home for another 3 hours. For the first time since my mother's funeral, I felt something stronger than grief. Hope. Not because I knew the truth, but because I finally knew where it might be waiting. I carefully returned the letter to its envelope. Then I placed both inside my purse instead of the filing cabinet. Some instinct told me they were no longer safe anywhere Richard could easily search. That evening, when Richard came home, he found me quietly reading a novel in the living room. I smiled as naturally as I could. "How was your meeting?" "Productive." "I'm glad. What did you do today?" For a fraction of a second, I considered telling him about the attic, about the letter, about Vault 317. Instead, I closed my book. Oh, nothing important. It was the first lie I had ever told my husband. And somehow, it felt like the first truly wise decision I had made in a very long time. I hardly slept the night after discovering my mother's letter. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words she had written in blue ink decades earlier. Trust the originals, not the copies. By 6 o'clock the next morning, I was already dressed. I chose a navy blue blazer my mother had always liked and tucked the envelope securely inside my handbag. Somehow wearing that jacket made me feel as though she were walking beside me. Richard came downstairs a few minutes later. He looked surprised to find breakfast already on the table. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep." He poured himself a cup of coffee. "I've got another meeting this morning." "With the attorney?" "Yes." I smiled. "I was thinking about visiting the garden center today." "That sounds nice." He kissed my cheek, grabbed his briefcase, and walked toward the garage. "I probably won't be home until dinner." As the front door closed behind him, I waited another 10 minutes before picking up my phone. "Emily." "I'm already in the car," she answered before I could explain. "You knew I was calling. I had a feeling today was the day. I think I'm ready." "So am I." First National Bank stood downtown, occupying the same granite building it had occupied for nearly 70 years. My parents had banked there. Richard and I had opened our first joint savings account there shortly after we married. I had walked through those bronze doors dozens of times over the years. Yet that morning the building felt intimidating. Emily parked across the street. Before getting out of the car, she turned toward me. "Mom, if anything feels wrong, we leave." "I know." "If anyone pressures you, we stop." "I know." "If Dad somehow shows up." I finished her sentence. "We stay calm," she smiled. "Exactly." Together we crossed the street. The marble lobby looked almost unchanged from my childhood. Tall ceilings, dark wood counters, polished brass railings. Everything smelled faintly of old paper and furniture polish. A woman wearing a navy blazer greeted us warmly. "Good morning. How may I help you?" I took a slow breath. "My name is Virginia Coleman. I believe my late mother maintained a safe deposit vault here." The woman typed my name into her computer. "One moment, Mrs. Coleman." Several seconds passed. Then she looked up again. "I'll ask our branch manager to speak with you." Emily and I exchanged a quick glance. That hadn't been the response either of us expected. A few minutes later, a man in his early 60s approached us. "I'm David Foster, the branch manager." He shook both our hands politely. "Mrs. Coleman, would you join me in my office?" His tone was professional but unusually careful. Inside his office, he closed the door before sitting down. "I understand you're inquiring about a safe deposit vault connected to your late mother." "Yes." I removed my mother's handwritten note from my purse. "I was instructed to ask about Vault 317. The manager studied the note carefully. His expression changed almost immediately. He looked back at me. "May I see your identification?" I handed him my driver's license. He compared it with information on his screen. Then he nodded. "Thank you." Without saying anything further, he excused himself. Emily whispered, "That's strange." "I know." 5 minutes later, he returned carrying a thick leather folder. He placed it gently on his desk. "Mrs. Coleman, there are additional instructions associated with this vault." "What kind of instructions?" "I'm afraid I cannot discuss their contents until we've completed our verification procedures." My heartbeat quickened. So the vault exists? Yes. Emily squeezed my hand beneath the desk. The manager continued. Your mother established this arrangement more than 20 years ago. 20 years. Long before anyone suspected there would ever be conflict. Can we open it today? I asked. Possibly. What do you mean? He hesitated. The authorization requires several verification steps. What steps? Identity, documentation, and confirmation that no legal restrictions currently prevent access. Emily frowned. My mother is the designated beneficiary. I understand. We're simply following your mother's written instructions. Something about that sentence made me feel unexpectedly emotional. Even now, my mother was still protecting me. The manager stood. If you'll follow me. He led us through a secure hallway requiring multiple keycards. Heavy steel doors opened one after another. The farther we walked, the quieter everything became. Finally, we reached a large reinforced room lined with hundreds of vault compartments. The walls themselves looked capable of surviving a tornado. The manager stopped beside one particular section. A small brass plate read, "For a moment I simply stared at it." This tiny number had quietly existed while my entire life was changing around me. The manager inserted one key, then turned toward me. Mrs. Coleman, before we proceed, I need you to answer several security questions personally established by your mother. My throat tightened. I'm ready. What was your maternal grandmother's maiden name? Whitaker. What town were you born in? Dayton. What object did your mother list as your favorite childhood possession? I smiled despite my nerves. A red bicycle. He nodded. One answer after another matched perfectly. When we finished, he looked satisfied. It appears everything is in order. He reached toward the lock. Before he could turn the key, a familiar voice echoed behind us. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Every muscle in my body froze. Richard. He walked into the vault room wearing his usual gray business suit, followed by the same attorney I had met weeks earlier, Mark Jensen. Richard looked calm, almost cheerful. Virginia. There you are. I stared at him. How did you know we were here? I called home. You weren't there. So I assumed. Emily stepped in front of me. What are you doing here? Richard ignored her. Instead, he addressed the bank manager. My wife is confused. The manager remained expressionless. Sir, my wife no longer has any legal interest in this vault. My heart began pounding. Richard removed a folder from his briefcase. She voluntarily transferred every inherited asset months ago. He handed several documents to the manager. I have copies. Mark Jensen added calmly. Our records indicate Mrs. Coleman relinquished all ownership rights. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Richard looked directly at me. You don't remember because we handled this together. I whispered, no. We absolutely did. Emily's voice became sharp. She's never seen those documents. Richard sighed dramatically. Emily, please don't make this harder for your mother. I suddenly understood why he had always insisted on handling everything himself. He wasn't just organizing paperwork. He had been preparing this moment. Preparing to convince everyone, including me, that I had willingly surrendered everything. The manager quietly examined the documents Richard had provided. The silence stretched painfully. Finally, he closed the folder. Then he looked at Richard. I understand your position. Relief spread across Richard's face. But, the manager continued carefully, our institution cannot determine ownership based solely upon photocopied documents presented today. Richard's smile faded. What? The vault is governed by separate contractual instructions established decades ago. Mark Jensen frowned. Those instructions have already been superseded. The manager shook his head. Not according to the vault agreement. Richard's confidence began slipping for the first time. My wife transferred everything. Perhaps. But that question is not decided here. What does that mean? The manager turned toward me. Mrs. Coleman. Your mother anticipated the possibility of conflicting claims. My pulse raced. What happens now? He looked toward the massive steel vault. The original authorization package inside Vault 317 will determine who possesses legal authority to proceed. For the first time since entering the bank, Richard stopped smiling. For several long seconds, no one moved. The only sound inside the vault room was the soft hum of the climate control system protecting hundreds of safe deposit boxes. It was strangely peaceful, almost sacred, as though the room itself had witnessed generations of secrets without ever taking sides. Richard was the first to speak. "This is ridiculous." He looked directly at David Foster, the branch manager. "My wife already transferred every relevant asset. Those documents have been reviewed by an attorney." David remained composed. "I understand your position, Mr. Coleman. Then open the vault in accordance with the paperwork." "I'm afraid it isn't that simple." Mark Jensen stepped forward. "Legally, my client's documents establish ownership." David shook his head slightly. "They may establish a legal argument. They do not override the contractual instructions attached to this particular vault." Richard's jaw tightened. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying your mother-in-law created a very unusual arrangement." He turned toward me. "Mrs. Coleman, your mother deposited specific original documents under a sealed authorization. The agreement states that if conflicting claims regarding her estate ever arose, the originals stored inside this vault would become the controlling reference for determining the next legal steps." Emily quietly whispered beside me. Grandma knew. I felt tears gathering in my eyes. She had known. Not exactly what would happen, but she had anticipated that something might. David continued. "The vault also contains written procedural instructions that neither the bank nor any family member has viewed since the day your mother sealed them." Richard immediately objected. "Then how do you know what's inside?" "We don't. We only know the procedure." He looked toward the heavy steel compartment. "And today is the first time those procedures have ever been activated." The words echoed through the room. First time, 20 years. My mother had planned for a possibility she prayed would never become necessary. David removed a thick ledger from a nearby cabinet. "This vault requires 2 bank officers to witness the opening." He pressed a button on the wall. Within moments, another employee entered, introducing herself as Assistant Manager Linda Chavez. She verified several identification numbers before signing the ledger. Everything was deliberate, methodical, almost ceremonial. Richard's impatience became increasingly obvious. "Can we please stop wasting time?" David ignored the interruption. Instead, he handed me a pair of white cotton gloves. "Mrs. Coleman, because many of these documents may be decades old, we'd appreciate it if you handled them carefully." I slipped on the gloves with trembling hands. David inserted the bank's master key into Vault 317. Then he looked at me. "Mrs. Coleman." "The second key." I stared at him. "I don't have one." "You don't?" "No." Emily frowned. "The letter never mentioned a key." David didn't seem surprised. "In that case," he opened the leather folder once more. "There is a secondary authorization." He carefully unfolded another document. "It states that if the beneficiary no longer possesses the personal key, the bank may access the compartment using its emergency protocol after identity verification." Richard folded his arms. "So let's get on with it." David nodded to Linda. Together they activated a second locking mechanism hidden behind a brass plate. A faint metallic click echoed through the room. Then another. Slowly. The long steel drawer slid outward. My heartbeat became so loud I could barely hear anything else. For years I had believed the truth existed somewhere beyond my reach. Now, it was sitting less than 3 feet away. David stepped back respectfully. "Mrs. Coleman, the contents are yours to examine." I looked inside. There was no jewelry, no stacks of cash, no glittering family treasure. Instead, the drawer contained 6 carefully labeled archival boxes. Every one was wrapped in protective cloth. Every one carried my mother's handwriting. Emily leaned closer. She organized everything, exactly as she always had. The first box was labeled property records, the second trust documents, the third personal letters, the fourth legal originals, the fifth family journals. Then my eyes settled on the final box. Its label simply read, "If Virginia needs answers." My breath caught. I reached for that box first. Richard immediately spoke. I think the legal documents should be reviewed before anything else. His voice sounded strained, not angry, nervous. David answered calmly. Mrs. Coleman may review the contents in any order she chooses. I lifted the lid. Inside rested a small cassette recorder, several labeled cassette tapes, a handwritten notebook, and another sealed envelope. Across the front, my mother had written, "Open this before anything else." I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single page. Virginia, if you are reading this, events have unfolded exactly as I feared they might. Before you read another document, listen to tape 1. Then compare every copy anyone shows you against the originals stored here. Do not argue from memory. Argue from evidence. Love, Mother. Emily quietly wiped a tear from her cheek. She really thought of everything. Richard laughed uneasily. This proves nothing. No, Emily answered. But we're just getting started. I picked up the cassette recorder. David looked apologetic. I'm afraid the batteries are long dead. I'll get replacements. Within minutes, he returned carrying fresh batteries from the bank's maintenance office. He installed them himself. The recorder clicked to life. Everyone stood silently. I pressed play. For a second, only static filled the room. Then, my mother's voice, older, gentle, completely unmistakable. If you're hearing this, sweetheart, then I'm very sorry. Every hair on my arms stood up. Hearing her voice after so many months felt almost impossible. Emily covered her mouth with both hands. Even David lowered his eyes respectfully. I hope I'm simply being overly cautious. But if someone is claiming papers exist that contradict what I told you throughout my life, believe the originals. They are beside this recorder. She paused. I could hear paper moving. Then she continued. I have instructed my attorney to place every signed original inside this vault. No copies. No replacements. No revisions. Only originals. Richard suddenly shifted his weight. His confidence had disappeared completely. Mother continued speaking. Virginia, I love you with all my heart. You trust people because you believe honesty is natural. I once believed that too. But documents can be altered. Copies can be replaced. Signatures can appear where they should never have appeared. My heart nearly stopped. Richard interrupted. This recording could have been made at any time. Emily turned sharply toward him. So now you're questioning Grandma. I'm questioning the relevance. David raised a hand. Please allow the recording to continue. Mother's voice returned. If anyone ever tells you that you willingly surrendered everything, ask them to explain why these originals say otherwise. Silence. Then one final sentence. I've a hidden truth where only patience, not power, could reach it. The tape ended with a soft click. Nobody spoke. Richard looked pale. Mark Jensen no longer appeared nearly as confident as when they had entered the vault. Emily slowly turned toward the fourth archival box, the one labeled Legal Originals. Mom, she whispered, I think it's time. With careful hands, I opened the box. Inside lay dozens of original notarized documents arranged chronologically. Every page carried official seals, original signatures, original notarizations. Nothing looked altered. Nothing looked hurried. The first document immediately caught Emily's attention. She lifted it carefully. Her eyes widened. Then she looked directly at Richard. You told Mom she transferred ownership voluntarily. Richard said nothing. Emily held up the original document. This one says exactly the opposite. The room became perfectly still, for the first time since this nightmare had begun. It wasn't just my memory standing against Richard's story. It was the evidence itself. And it had been quietly waiting inside Vault 317, long before anyone ever thought to lie. No one in the vault room spoke for several seconds. Emily continued holding the original document in both hands, careful not to bend the aging paper. The official county seal remained crisp despite the passing years, and beneath it was my mother's unmistakable signature. There was no uncertainty about its authenticity. Richard finally cleared his throat. One document doesn't tell the whole story. His voice had changed. The calm confidence that had carried him into the bank was gone. In its place was a carefully controlled tension I had never heard before. Emily didn't argue. Instead, she quietly handed the document to David Foster. "Would you read the highlighted paragraph, please?" David adjusted his glasses. His eyes moved slowly across the page. Then he looked up. "This document establishes the Brooks Family Preservation Trust." Mark Jensen immediately stepped closer. "That isn't unusual." "No," David agreed. "It isn't." He continued reading. "The trustee shall preserve all inherited family assets exclusively for the benefit of my daughter Virginia Brooks Coleman. No spouse representative attorney in fact, or subsequent joint financial arrangement, shall alter the beneficiary designation without Virginia's personal appearance before the trust attorney and two independent witnesses." Emily looked directly at Richard. "Did Mom ever appear before Grandma's trust attorney?" Richard remained silent. David continued. "Photocopied amendments shall not supersede these original instructions unless accompanied by the original trust amendment certificate retained in this vault." He slowly lowered the paper. "I don't see such a certificate." Neither did anyone else. Richard folded his arms. "You've only reviewed one page." "Exactly," Emily answered. "So let's review all of them." I stood quietly beside them, trying to absorb everything. Until that morning, I hadn't even known this trust existed. My mother had never hidden things from me, or so I had believed. Now I understood she hadn't hidden the trust from me because she distrusted me. She had hidden it because she feared someone else might eventually discover it. David carefully opened another folder from the box labeled Legal Originals. "This appears to be a notarized memorandum." Emily nodded. "Please." David began reading aloud. "To the trustee and any reviewing authority. My daughter trusts easily." The words immediately caught my attention. "Should any dispute arise involving copies of financial documents, compare every questioned document against the originals secured herein." He turned another page. "No asset listed in Schedule A may be voluntarily transferred without my daughter's written declaration executed in person before Attorney Harold Wallace." Emily looked at me. "Mom, do you remember signing anything in Attorney Wallace's office?" I shook my head. "No." "When did he retire?" "About 2 years before Grandma passed away." Emily turned to David. "If these instructions required Mom to appear personally before Mr. Wallace, and Mr. Wallace had already retired." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The implication hung heavily in the room. Mark Jensen finally spoke. "Retirement alone doesn't invalidate later transfers." Emily remained calm. "I agree. But if later transfers claim procedures were followed that physically couldn't have happened." "That's a problem," Richard interrupted. "You don't know when the transfers occurred." Emily quietly picked up another document. "Actually, this one is dated 8 months after Attorney Wallace permanently retired." Richard's face lost even more color. I stared at him. For months I had questioned my own memory. Now, facts were beginning to question his. David carefully placed each document on a large felt-covered examination table. "There appears to be considerably more material." The next folder contained certified copies of property deeds, original investment account, beneficiary forms, insurance designations. Each document had been individually notarized years earlier. Nothing looked hastily assembled. Everything reflected meticulous planning, exactly the way my mother approached every important responsibility in her life. Then Emily stopped. "Wait." She reached toward a sealed evidence envelope tucked beneath the remaining folders. Across the front were the words, "Comparison Samples." Inside rested several sheets containing signatures. Some belonged to my mother, some belonged to me. Others appeared to be blank signature exemplars created for legal reference. Emily examined them carefully. Then she looked toward Richard. "When did Mom supposedly sign the voluntary transfer forms?" Richard answered cautiously. "Several months ago." Emily nodded. She picked up one of the documents Richard had presented earlier that morning. "David, may we compare this copy against Mom's archived signature samples?" Richard immediately objected. Those aren't forensic documents. No, Emily replied. But I'm a forensic accountant. I review signature consistency during fraud investigations almost every week. Mark Jensen stepped forward. You're not a handwriting expert. I'm not claiming to be. I'm identifying obvious irregularities. She placed both pages side by side. For nearly a minute, nobody interrupted her. Finally, she pointed toward my signature. Mom, when you naturally sign your name, where do you lift your pen? I looked closely. I usually don't. I write Virginia in one motion. Exactly. She pointed toward the questioned signature. This version pauses after the letter R. I blinked. It did. I had never noticed. Emily continued. Your natural signature always slopes slightly upward. This one gradually slopes downward, she pointed again. And your capital C in Coleman has looked identical for over 30 years. The question signature looked noticeably different. Not dramatically, just wrong. The sort of difference most people would never notice. Richard suddenly laughed. Signatures change. Emily nodded. They certainly can. But not usually in 3 different ways on the same document. Silence. Even Mark Jensen leaned forward to examine the pages more closely. David quietly cleared his throat. Mrs. Coleman, I believe additional professional review will ultimately be necessary. I agree. But I also believe these materials deserve immediate protection. He carefully returned every document to its archival sleeves. No original document will leave this room today without proper legal documentation. Richard took one quick step forward. I have a right to review those records. David politely blocked his path. You may request access through appropriate legal channels. My wife and I. He stopped himself, perhaps realizing that every time he referred to me now, he sounded less like a husband and more like someone asserting ownership. Emily gently touched my arm. Mom, I barely heard her. My attention had shifted to another object resting quietly inside the final archival box. Unlike the legal papers, it wasn't sealed. It was an ordinary black leather journal. The cover had faded with age. Across the front, written in gold ink, were only 3 words. Private notes. Mother's handwriting again. I carefully opened the journal. Inside were dated entries spanning nearly 15 years. Some described ordinary family events, holiday dinners, church picnics, Emily's college graduation. Then halfway through the journal, I found an entry that stole the air from my lungs. Richard insists on handling every financial conversation now. Virginia believes he's simply trying to help. I hope she's right. But I've started keeping additional records, just in case. I slowly turned another page. Another entry. Today Richard asked whether I intended to simplify my estate. He seemed unusually interested in whether original documents remained at home. I told him only copies were available. That was not entirely true. My hands began trembling. Mother had noticed. Years before I had. Another page. If I'm becoming overly suspicious, I pray Virginia never needs to read these words. But if she ever does, it means I failed to protect her while I was alive. I closed the journal. Tears blurred my vision. Emily quietly embraced me. You didn't fail, Grandma, she whispered, almost as if my mother could still hear her. You protected her better than anyone realized. Across the room, I looked at Richard. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the journal. And for the first time in nearly 40 years, I saw genuine fear in my husband's eyes. Not fear of losing money. Not fear of embarrassment. Fear of the truth that my mother had quietly documented long before either of us understood what was happening. The drive home from the bank was the quietest car ride of my life. Emily kept both hands on the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't ask whether I was all right. She already knew I wasn't. I sat in the passenger seat with my mother's leather journal resting in my lap. David Foster had allowed us to leave with certified copies of the documents and the journal after completing the necessary chain of custody paperwork. The originals remained secured inside Vault 317, protected exactly as my mother had intended. The certified copies felt heavy, not because of their weight, because of what they represented. For months, I had wondered whether I was becoming forgetful, whether grief had clouded my judgment, whether I had somehow signed away pieces of my family's history without remembering. Now I knew something far more frightening. Someone had counted on me believing that. Emily finally spoke as we stopped at a red light. "What are you thinking?" I looked out the window. "I'm thinking about all the times I apologized. To Dad. To everyone. I kept saying I must have forgotten." She reached across the center console and squeezed my hand. "You were never the problem." I wanted to believe her, but after nearly a year of questioning my own memory, confidence didn't return in a single afternoon. It returned one careful step at a time. When we pulled into my driveway, Richard's car was gone. Emily frowned. "He must have left after we did." I nodded. "I don't think he'll come home for a while." We carried the copies inside and spread them across the dining room table. For nearly 3 hours, Emily organized everything into neat piles: original trust provisions, property records, journal entries, bank correspondence, audio transcript notes. She worked the same way she always had, as a forensic accountant, methodical patient refusing to jump to conclusions. Every document received a colored tab. Every date went onto a legal pad. Every signature was photographed and enlarged using her tablet. Watching her work reminded me of my mother. Neither woman ever rushed. Facts mattered more than emotion. Around 5 o'clock, Emily looked up from the paperwork. "Mom, I've noticed something." "What is it?" She turned the legal pad toward me. Across the top, she had written 3 dates: March 14th, April 2nd, May 19th. "What do these mean?" "These are the dates Dad claims you signed the major transfer documents." "So," she pointed toward another list, "according to Grandma's journal, she was with you on March 14th. I looked more closely. The journal entry described a weekend gardening trip we had taken together. Mother had even mentioned buying tomato plants. Emily continued. "On April 2, you were visiting me in Cincinnati. I remember that. You stayed overnight." She pointed to the third date. "And May 19, you and Dad attended Ethan's school concert. So, the transfer document says you met with Mark Jensen's office that afternoon." I stared at her. "That's impossible." "Exactly." My pulse quickened. For the first time, the inconsistencies weren't abstract. They were measurable, specific, real. Emily slowly organized the pages into chronological order. "The timeline doesn't fit." "What do you mean?" "If the dates are wrong, then either the paperwork is inaccurate, or someone's memory is." She didn't have to finish the sentence. We both knew which possibility seemed more likely now. The front door suddenly opened. Richard. He froze the moment he saw the dining room table. Every document lay neatly arranged. Every folder was open. Every page had colored notes attached. He slowly removed his coat. "What is all this?" Emily answered calmly. "We're organizing Grandma's records." Richard forced a smile. "I thought we already finished that." "Apparently not." He walked toward the table. I noticed his eyes immediately searching for specific papers, not reading them, searching, almost as if checking whether something particular had been found. "What exactly did the bank give you?" David's warning echoed in my mind. "Do not surrender possession of certified copies unnecessarily." I quietly closed the nearest folder. "Only copies we're entitled to review." Richard extended his hand. "Let me see." "No." The word surprised even me. It was the first time in years I had refused him so directly. His eyebrows lifted. "Virginia, I'd like to review everything first." "I've already reviewed it." "I haven't." Silence settled between us. Emily quietly continued arranging documents, refusing to participate. Richard changed tactics. His voice softened. "Sweetheart, I know today was overwhelming." It was. "You don't need to carry this burden." "I think I do. I can explain every document." "I'd rather have our attorney explain them." He stared at me. "Our attorney?" "No. My attorney." The distinction hung heavily in the room. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then Richard slowly nodded. if that's what you want. It is. He turned toward Emily. You've filled your mother's head with unnecessary suspicion. Emily finally looked up. No. The documents did. Richard laughed quietly. You've always assumed the worst about me. I've assumed nothing. I'm reading evidence. Richard shook his head. You don't understand marriage. Emily's expression became unexpectedly sad. I understand trust. And trust doesn't require someone to stop asking questions. Richard walked away without answering. A few minutes later, we heard his office door close. Then, the unmistakable sound of the lock clicking into place. Emily looked toward the hallway. He's protecting something, I whispered, or destroying it. That possibility settled over us like a storm cloud. Emily immediately picked up her phone. I'm calling someone. Who? A civil litigation attorney I worked with last year. Within an hour, we were sitting in the office of Margaret Ellis, a respected estate attorney downtown. She spent nearly 2 hours reviewing the certified copies. Unlike Richard's replacement attorney, Margaret encouraged questions. Lots of them. She asked where every document originated, who possessed the originals, who had drafted later paperwork, who had witnessed signatures. She took almost no notes at first. Instead, she listened, completely. When we finally finished, Margaret leaned back thoughtfully. I want to be very careful with my words. My stomach tightened. What do you think? I think there are enough inconsistencies that this deserves a formal forensic review. Emily nodded. I agree, Margaret continued. I also believe you should immediately request preservation orders. What does that mean? It prevents potentially relevant documents from being destroyed. Emily and I exchanged worried glances. Richard's locked office, his filing cabinets, his computer. Margaret seemed to read our thoughts. If there's evidence, it needs to be protected. She reached for another folder. I'd also like authorization to obtain financial records. What kind, though? Bank statements, investment transfers, property transactions, anything involving your inherited assets. I hesitated. Will that really help? Margaret gave a small smile. Mrs. Coleman, money leaves footprints. If assets changed hands, there will almost always be records. Her confidence wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, professional, steady, exactly what I needed. Before we left, she handed me a single sheet of paper. At the top was written, "Do not discuss the investigation." I looked at her. You think I shouldn't tell Richard? Not yet. Why? Because people sometimes behave unpredictably once they realize documents are being examined. The drive home felt different than the drive to the bank that morning. Earlier, I had been searching for answers. Now, I was beginning to understand the size of the questions. As Emily pulled into my driveway, once again my phone buzzed. An unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously. This is Virginia Coleman. The man on the other end spoke politely. Mrs. Coleman, my name is Daniel Brooks. I'm a forensic financial investigator working with attorney Margaret Ellis. I'll be reviewing the financial history connected to your mother's estate. I swallowed. When do we begin? His answer sent another chill through me. I already have. And I believe I've found the first transfer that shouldn't exist. I barely slept after speaking with Daniel Brooks. His final sentence echoed through my mind long after I hung up the phone. I believe I've found the first transfer that shouldn't exist. Until then, every discovery had come from papers hidden inside my mother's vault. Those documents told me what she intended. Daniel's investigation would reveal what had actually happened. The difference between those two things would determine whether my life had been built on misunderstanding or deception. The next morning, Emily arrived before 8 o'clock carrying 2 legal pads, a laptop, and a box of pastries from my favorite bakery. I figured we'd need breakfast. I smiled faintly. Thank you. Neither of us had much appetite. At exactly 9 o'clock, attorney Margaret Ellis and Daniel Brooks joined us through a secure video conference. Daniel appeared to be in his early 40s with short, gray-streaked hair and the calm, deliberate manner of someone who spent his career studying financial records instead of people. He greeted us warmly. Mrs. Coleman, Ms. Coleman. Good morning. Margaret spoke first. Daniel has completed an initial review of publicly available financial records and several documents you've already provided. Daniel nodded. I'd like to stress that these are preliminary findings. I haven't reached any final conclusions. I appreciated those words. For months, I had lived with certainty from people who never questioned themselves. Careful honesty felt refreshing. Daniel shared his screen. A timeline appeared. Across the top were dates covering nearly 3 years. Colored lines connected bank accounts, property records, and legal filings. It helps to view this chronologically, he explained. The first unusual event occurred approximately 6 months before Eleanor Brooks passed away. Emily leaned closer. What happened? Daniel highlighted one transaction. A limited liability company was created. The company name appeared, Riverside Heritage Holdings LLC. I frowned. I've never heard of it. Daniel nodded. Neither had I. Which made me curious. He clicked another file. The registered organizer was Richard Coleman. I felt my stomach tighten. He never mentioned a company, Daniel continued. Initially, the company had no assets. Nothing unusual there. Many businesses begin that way. He highlighted another date. 8 months later, the company acquired partial interests in 2 investment accounts. Emily interrupted. Grandma's investment accounts. Daniel nodded. According to county and banking records. Yes. I stared at the screen. How could that happen? That's exactly the question we're trying to answer. He opened another document. This transfer references a voluntary assignment. Emily looked at me. The one Dad claims you signed. Daniel nodded again. Correct. But there's a problem. He enlarged the scanned paperwork. The assignment references Trust Amendment Number 4. Margaret quietly folded her hands. The original trust documents contain only 3 amendments. Daniel smiled slightly. Exactly. There is no Amendment Number 4 inside the vault. The room became silent. Emily finally whispered, so the document references something that doesn't exist. Correct, Daniel continued. That alone doesn't prove fraud. But it creates a serious inconsistency. He clicked again. Another chart appeared. This concerns property taxes. I frowned. What about them? Mrs. Coleman. Did your mother own a small commercial building on Jefferson Avenue? Yes. She rented it to a family-owned pharmacy. Daniel pointed toward the screen. The ownership records changed 18 months ago. I don't remember that. According to county filings, ownership shifted into the same LLC. Riverside Heritage Holdings, Richard's company. I struggled to breathe. My mother never would have approved that. Margaret spoke softly. That's why documentation matters. Daniel wasn't finished. There are additional irregularities. He displayed another timeline. This concerns banking activity. Emily immediately recognized several account numbers. Those belong to Grandma. Daniel nodded. Funds were gradually transferred. Not in one large payment. In dozens of smaller transactions. Each one appeared ordinary by itself. But together, he highlighted the total. Over $400,000. The room fell completely silent. I whispered, "Where did it go?" Daniel clicked once more. The money flowed through 3 accounts before eventually arriving at Riverside Heritage Holdings, Richard's company. I covered my mouth. Emily reached for my hand. Neither of us spoke. Daniel's voice remained calm. Again. I am not saying these transfers were unauthorized. I'm saying they deserve explanation. Margaret leaned toward the camera. An explanation requires records. Daniel nodded. Exactly. He opened another page. This surprised me even more. A property appraisal appeared. It showed our family home, its estimated value, mortgage history. Then another document, a refinancing application. Applicant Richard Coleman, co-applicant Virginia Coleman. I blinked. I never refinanced the house. Daniel looked directly into the camera. According to these records, your signature appears on the application. Emily immediately asked, when? Daniel enlarged the date. I looked at it. then looked again. I almost laughed from disbelief. That day. What happened that day? Margaret asked. I answered quietly. I was in the hospital. Everyone looked at me. I had cataract surgery. My eyes were covered for almost 24 hours. Daniel slowly removed his glasses. I was afraid you might say something like that. Emily whispered, Mom physically couldn't have signed anything. Daniel nodded. Exactly. He made another note. The timeline is becoming increasingly important. For nearly another hour, he carefully explained each transaction. He never exaggerated, never accused, never speculated beyond the evidence. Every unusual transfer received its own page. Every missing record received its own notation. Finally, he closed the presentation. I have one more item. He held up a scanned document. This came from archived notary records. Margaret leaned forward immediately. What is it? A refusal log. I frowned. A what? Daniel explained. Professional notaries occasionally document situations where they refuse to notarize a signature. He enlarged the page. Date, location, reason. Then one line caught everyone's attention. Requested notarization refused. Reason signer absent. Requested by Richard Coleman. I felt every ounce of strength leave my body. Emily whispered, Oh my God. Daniel continued. The notary made handwritten notes. He read them carefully. Male individual requested acknowledgement for spouse not physically present. Explained that notarization could not proceed. Individual appeared frustrated and departed with unsigned documents. Margaret closed her notebook. That is extremely significant. Daniel nodded. I agree. It doesn't prove what happened afterward, but it documents an attempt. I stared at the screen. For months I had blamed myself, wondered if age had finally caught up with me, questioned every forgotten conversation, every uncertain memory, every signature. Now an independent stranger, someone who had never met my family, had found evidence suggesting I hadn't imagined any of it. The confusion hadn't originated inside my own mind. It had been created around me. After the meeting ended, Emily quietly closed her laptop. Neither of us spoke. We simply sat together in silence. Finally, she looked at me. You believed him because you loved him. Tears filled my eyes. I kept thinking marriage meant never doubting. She shook her head gently. No. Marriage should mean never having to. At that exact moment, we heard a vehicle pull into the driveway. Richard. Through the front window, I watched him step out of his car. He wasn't alone. Walking beside him was his younger brother, Thomas Coleman. Daniel's chart suddenly flashed through my mind. The hidden transfers, the mysterious LLC, the money trail, and one final observation Daniel had made just before ending the meeting. We're now examining several transactions connected to a relative of Mr. Coleman. I hadn't asked which relative. As Thomas walked toward my front door, I realized I no longer needed to. The moment I saw Thomas Coleman step out of Richard's truck, I understood that whatever happened next would not be accidental. Richard never brought his younger brother into family matters. Not when my father died. Not when Emily graduated from college. Not even during my mother's funeral. If Thomas was here now, there was a reason. Emily noticed my expression. You think this is about the investigation? I nodded. I do. Neither of us moved as the front door opened. Richard walked in first, forcing a smile that looked more practiced than sincere. Thomas followed a few steps behind, carrying a leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm. He looked uncomfortable. He had always been the quieter of the two brothers. While Richard enjoyed being the center of attention, Thomas preferred to stay in the background. During family holidays, he usually helped wash dishes while everyone else talked in the living room. Seeing him standing in my foyer made me uneasy. Virginia, Richard said, setting his keys on the hallway table. I thought we should all have a conversation. I wasn't expecting company. I know. Thomas cleared his throat. Hello, Virginia. Emily. Emily offered only a polite nod. No one suggested sitting down. For several awkward seconds, all four of us simply stood there. Finally, Richard gestured toward the dining room. Can we talk? I looked at Emily. She gave the smallest nod, reminding me without words that we now had legal counsel and documented evidence. I wasn't alone anymore. We gathered around the dining room table, where the neatly organized folders still lay stacked in front of us. Richard immediately noticed them. "So you've been busy," Emily answered calmly. "We've been organizing records." Richard looked at the colored tabs attached to each folder. "I see." Thomas shifted uneasily beside him. Richard finally spoke. "I think this situation has gotten out of hand." I folded my hands together. "What situation?" "All these accusations." "I haven't accused you of anything." "You've hired attorneys." "I've hired someone to help me understand my own financial records." "There's a difference." He sighed dramatically. "Virginia, you know I would never intentionally hurt you." There was a time when hearing those words would have ended every doubt I carried. "Not anymore," I answered quietly. "I used to know that." Silence settled over the room. Richard looked genuinely wounded, or perhaps he wanted me to believe he was. "I've spent 38 years taking care of this family." "I know." "I handled every mortgage payment." "I know." "I know." "I worked overtime." "I know." "So why would you suddenly believe I'm your enemy?" I looked directly into his eyes. "Because facts don't depend on feelings." His expression changed ever so slightly. Not anger, calculation. He realized emotional appeals were no longer enough. Thomas finally spoke. "Virginia, I think Richard has made some mistakes." Richard turned sharply. "Thomas." His brother ignored him. "I don't mean criminal mistakes. I mean, he sometimes believes he's helping even when he shouldn't." Richard's jaw tightened. "I don't need you explaining my marriage." Thomas lowered his voice. "I'm trying to keep this family together." Emily leaned forward. "Then answer a simple question." Thomas looked at her. "Did you know Riverside Heritage Holdings existed?" Richard answered before his brother could speak. "That's irrelevant." Emily calmly repeated the question. "Mr. Coleman, did you know?" Thomas hesitated. Too long. Finally he nodded. "Yes." My heart sank. "What was it for?" Thomas looked at Richard before answering. "He told me it was an investment company." "Did you own part of it?" Another pause. "Yes." The room became perfectly still. Emily opened one of the folders in front of her. "Our investigator traced several inherited assets through that company." Thomas looked genuinely surprised. I didn't know where the assets came from," Richard interrupted immediately. "That's enough." "No," I said quietly. "It isn't." For the first time in our marriage, Richard looked at me as though he no longer recognized the woman sitting across from him. "I want the truth." "You already know the truth." "I know your version." His voice became firmer. "My version is reality." Emily slid one certified document across the table. "The trust says otherwise." Richard barely glanced at it. "The trust is outdated. The original instructions were never revoked. They didn't need to be." Emily opened another folder. "The transfer paperwork references Trust Amendment Number 4. "There isn't a Trust Amendment Number 4. Richard's eyes flickered for the briefest moment. It was almost imperceptible. But I saw it. So did Emily. Thomas looked confused. "What amendment?" Emily turned the document toward him. "This one." He read silently for nearly a minute. Then he frowned. "I've never seen this." Richard reached for the papers. "We're finished discussing legal matters." Emily gently placed her hand over the folder before he could take it. "No. We're just beginning." Richard stood abruptly. His chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "I've had enough." He looked directly at me. "Virginia, I want you to remember something. I've protected you your entire adult life." I slowly stood as well. "I never asked you to protect me from the truth." His face hardened. "I protected you from stress. You protected me from information. I simplified things. You removed my choices. Neither of us raised our voices. That somehow made the exchange even more painful." Thomas suddenly spoke again. "Richard, I think you should tell her." Richard stared at his brother. "Tell her what?" "The refinancing." Emily and I looked at Thomas simultaneously. What refinancing? I asked. Thomas's shoulders slumped. I assumed she knew. Knew what? Emily demanded. Richard answered sharply. Nothing. Thomas looked miserable. Richard, you told me Virginia agreed. My pulse quickened. Thomas continued quietly. You said both of you decided to refinance the house because interest rates had dropped. I congratulated you. I even signed paperwork as a business reference. Emily looked at Richard. My mother was recovering from cataract surgery that week. Thomas blinked. What? Richard said nothing. Emily continued. She physically couldn't attend any loan closing. Thomas slowly turned toward his brother. You told me she was there. Silence. A silence so complete I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking between each heartbeat. Tick, tick, tick. Finally, Thomas whispered, Richard, were you lying to me? Richard didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward the front window with his back to all of us. For several moments, he simply stared outside. Then, without turning around, he spoke. You don't understand, I answered softly. Help me understand. I was trying to secure our future. By signing my name, I never intended for anyone to get hurt. Emily shook her head slowly. People rarely intend the consequences. They intend the actions. Richard finally turned around. His eyes looked tired, much older than they had that morning. I moved money. Yes. I reorganized accounts. Yes. I created the company. Yes. But everything I did, I believed I could fix later. Margaret Ellis's words suddenly echoed in my mind. People sometimes behave unpredictably once they realize documents are being examined. Richard looked less like a confident husband now, and more like a man watching years of carefully controlled decisions unravel one sentence at a time. Thomas quietly picked up his portfolio. I should go. Richard didn't stop him. Before leaving, Thomas looked at me. Virginia, I'm sorry. I should have asked more questions. After the front door closed behind him, the house became strangely quiet. Richard remained standing by the window. I remained beside the dining room table. 38 years of marriage stood silently between us. Then my phone vibrated. A text message from attorney Margaret Ellis. The court approved our preservation order. No financial records, computers, or business files may now be altered or destroyed. Investigators will begin collecting evidence tomorrow morning. I slowly locked my phone. Richard noticed the movement. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw genuine defeat settle across his face. He finally understood something that my mother had understood years earlier. The truth was no longer hidden inside a vault. Tomorrow morning, it would begin speaking for itself. I had imagined a courtroom many times during the weeks that followed. In every version inside my mind, someone shouted. Someone slammed a fist on a table. Someone confessed dramatically. Reality was nothing like that. The Franklin County Courthouse was quiet, almost painfully quiet. People spoke in low voices. Attorneys carried thick binders instead of making emotional speeches. Judges listened far more than they talked. The truth I would learn rarely arrived with fireworks. It arrived one document at a time. 3 months had passed since the day we opened Vault 317. Those months had changed everything. Richard and I no longer lived together. Following Margaret Ellis's advice, I had moved into Emily's guest room while temporary financial orders were in place. The separation wasn't intended as punishment. It simply ensured that no further questions could arise about documents, computers, or financial records. I missed my home. I even missed parts of my old routine. But I no longer missed living with uncertainty. By the time our first civil hearing began, Daniel Brooks and Margaret had spent hundreds of hours reviewing financial records. Every bank transfer, every investment account, every refinancing document, every property filing. Boxes of evidence lined the counsel tables. Nothing resembled the dramatic courtroom scenes shown on television. Instead, everything depended on patience. Richard sat across the courtroom beside his attorney. He looked older than I remembered. His hair had become noticeably grayer over the previous months. His shoulders no longer carried the confidence that had once filled every room he entered. For a brief moment I remembered the young man I had married, the one who brought flowers after my first difficult week as a librarian, the one who held my hand at Emily's birth, the one who stayed awake all night when I had pneumonia. Remembering those moments hurt, because they had been real, just as the deception had been real. Both truths could exist at the same time. Judge Caroline Mercer entered the courtroom promptly at 9 o'clock. After preliminary matters were addressed, Margaret stood. Your Honor. This matter concerns disputed ownership transfers, alleged unauthorized financial transactions, and the legal effect of original trust documents preserved under independent custodial control. The judge nodded. I've reviewed the preliminary filings. Margaret called Daniel Brooks as her first witness. Daniel calmly walked to the witness stand and took the oath. Margaret began with simple questions. His education, his experience, his work investigating financial transactions. Only after establishing his qualifications did she turn toward the evidence. Mr. Brooks, did you review the financial history connected to Eleanor Brooks's estate? I did. What did you find? Daniel opened a binder. My investigation identified 43 significant asset transfers occurring over approximately 28 months. Were those transfers random? No. They followed a consistent pattern. What pattern? Larger inherited assets were first divided into smaller transactions. Those transactions then moved through intermediary accounts before ultimately being consolidated. Margaret nodded. Why is that significant? Daniel answered carefully. Large transfers attract attention. Smaller ones often do not. Richard's attorney immediately stood. Objection. Calls for speculation. Judge Mercer looked at Daniel. Can you testify only as to observable financial patterns? Yes, Your Honor. Sustained in part. Daniel continued without hesitation. I can state that the transactions consistently followed that sequence. Margaret displayed a large timeline on courtroom monitors. Colored arrows connected dozens of bank accounts. Even from where I sat, the pattern was unmistakable. Money moved, then moved again, then disappeared into Riverside Heritage Holdings. Margaret asked another question. Who controlled Riverside Heritage Holdings? Daniel looked toward the documents. Richard Coleman served as the managing member. And another individual, Thomas Coleman. Richard's attorney rose again. Objection. The existence of a company proves nothing improper. Margaret nodded. We agree. The company itself is not the issue. The movement of disputed inherited assets is. Judge Mercer allowed the testimony to continue. Next came one of the moments I would never forget. Margaret approached the witness stand carrying a sealed evidence envelope. Mr. Brooks, did your investigation include reviewing the original trust documents preserved inside Safe Deposit Vault 317? Yes. Were those documents maintained independently of the parties? They were. Were they materially different from several later photocopied documents? Daniel answered simply. Yes. The courtroom became very still. Margaret displayed two documents side by side. One was the original trust instruction. The other was the later transfer paperwork. She asked only one question. Do these documents describe the same legal authority? Daniel looked carefully. No. They conflict. Richard lowered his eyes. His attorney requested permission to cross-examine. She approached confidently. Mr. Brooks, you are not a handwriting expert. Correct. You cannot testify that any signature was forged. Correct. So your investigation does not prove fraud. Daniel remained calm. My investigation identifies inconsistencies requiring explanation. She smiled slightly. Inconsistencies aren't crimes. No. But unexplained inconsistencies involving financial records deserve careful review. Several jurors, because certain factual issues had been reserved for a jury determination, wrote notes. Margaret seemed satisfied. The next witness surprised everyone. David Foster, the bank manager. He testified about Vault 317. He described my mother's instructions, the chain of custody procedures, the independent preservation of original documents. Most importantly, he confirmed something that changed the atmosphere inside the courtroom. No one, he spoke clearly, no family member, no attorney, no bank employee, viewed the contents of Vault 317 between the day Eleanor Brooks sealed the vault and the day Mrs. Virginia Coleman requested access. Margaret asked quietly. So the originals remained untouched for approximately 20 years. Yes. Richard's attorney cross-examined him. Mr. Foster, can you personally verify every document inside the vault? No. But I can verify they remained continuously secured. Can you guarantee authenticity? I can guarantee uninterrupted custody. That distinction mattered. The courtroom understood why. After lunch, Margaret called another witness. Not a handwriting expert, not a banker, the retired notary whose refusal log Daniel had discovered. Her name was Patricia Lang. She walked slowly to the witness stand carrying an old appointment ledger. Margaret asked gently, Mrs. Lang, do you recognize this ledger? I do. I kept it throughout my career. She turned carefully to one page. I also documented every time I refused a notarization. Margaret asked why. Because unusual requests protect themselves through documentation. The judge nodded approvingly. Patricia adjusted her glasses. I remember one request clearly. Why? The gentleman became frustrated. She looked toward Richard. I believe that gentleman is sitting over there. Every eye in the courtroom turned. Richard stared straight ahead. Patricia continued. He asked me to notarize documents for his wife. What happened? I asked where his wife was. He said she couldn't attend. What did you do? I refused. Did you explain why? Yes. I told him the signer must personally appear. Margaret asked one final question. Did Mrs. Virginia Coleman ever appear that day? No. She was never there. Silence. Complete silence. Margaret returned to counsel table without another word. Sometimes the strongest testimony required no dramatic ending. The facts spoke for themselves. When court adjourned that afternoon, I remained seated while everyone else slowly gathered their belongings. Emily placed her arm around my shoulders. You okay? I nodded slowly. I kept waiting for someone to yell. She smiled faintly. Instead, everyone just kept telling the truth. As we walked toward the courthouse exit, Margaret caught up with us. The judge made several important rulings today. What happens now? I asked. She smiled. Tomorrow. The handwriting experts testify. And after reviewing today's evidence, I believe the court is very close to deciding that nearly every disputed transfer must be set aside. I closed my eyes briefly. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted Richard to suffer, but because after months of doubting myself, someone else had finally said what I had been afraid to believe. The law was beginning to recognize what my mother had protected all along. The truth had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting for someone willing to listen. The judge issued her written decision 3 weeks later. I wasn't in the courtroom when it arrived. I was standing in Emily's backyard, watering a row of tomato plants that she and Ethan had insisted on growing because they reminded them of my mother. The afternoon sun was warm, and for the first time in months, I had almost forgotten what it felt like to wait for another phone call from an attorney. Then my phone rang. Margaret Ellis. I knew before answering that something had changed. Hello, Virginia. Her voice was calm, but there was a warmth in it I hadn't heard before. The court has ruled. I set the watering can on the ground. Emily looked up from the porch, reading my expression immediately. What happened? She mouthed silently. I held up one finger. Margaret continued. The court declared the original trust documents preserved in Vault 317 to be controlling. I closed my eyes. The disputed transfer documents have been set aside pending final accounting. My knees suddenly felt weak. Emily hurried across the yard. I whispered, What does that mean? It means the court has ruled that the original instructions your mother created remain legally enforceable. The transfers based upon the conflicting documents cannot stand. I felt tears running down my face before I even realized I was crying. Margaret wasn't finished. The court also ordered the return of all identifiable trust assets still under Mr. Coleman's control. Emily wrapped her arms around me as I repeated the words. They're coming home. Not the money, not the property, the truth. The truth was finally coming home. Over the following weeks, accountants, trustees, and court-appointed specialists completed the work that judges could not. Every investment account was reviewed. Every deed was examined. Every remaining asset was traced. Some things had been sold years earlier and could not physically be returned. In those cases, the court ordered financial compensation instead. Other assets still existed exactly where they had always been. My mother's antique jewelry, her handwritten journals, the Jefferson Avenue building, several investment accounts, even the old walnut writing desk that had belonged to my grandmother. Each item carried more emotional weight than financial value. They represented history, family, promises. One afternoon, Daniel Brooks met us at the bank to return several restored records. He carried a neatly organized archival box. I thought you'd want these personally. Inside were dozens of original family photographs investigators had recovered from Richard's office. I smiled through tears. I thought these were gone. They were in a locked filing cabinet. Emily carefully lifted one photograph. Grandma Eleanor stood beside me on the day I graduated from library school. Both of us were laughing, neither of us looking at the camera. Daniel smiled. Sometimes the most valuable evidence isn't financial. It's personal. Before leaving, he paused. I've investigated financial fraud for almost 20 years. I looked at him. Most people think these cases are about money. They rarely are. They're usually about control. His words stayed with me long after he drove away. Control. That was exactly what had slowly entered my marriage without my noticing. Not all at once. One decision, one signature, one explanation, one reassurance. Until eventually I no longer realized I had surrendered the ability to make choices for myself. The divorce proceedings were remarkably quiet. Richard contested some financial calculations. He accepted others. Eventually, through his attorney, he requested a private meeting. Margaret asked whether I wished to attend. I thought about it for nearly 2 days. Finally, I agreed. Not because I hoped to save the marriage. That chapter had already ended. I agreed because I no longer wanted unanswered questions following me through the rest of my life. We met in a conference room at Margaret's office. Only the 2 attorneys remained nearby. Richard looked older than I had ever seen him. Not broken, simply tired. Very tired. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he did. I've rehearsed this conversation 100 times. So have I. He managed a sad smile. I believe that. He folded his hands together. I owe you an explanation. I answered quietly. I don't need excuses. I know. I only want honesty. He nodded. I never started out planning to steal anything. I believed him. Oddly enough, I did, because that matched everything I had learned. Terrible decisions rarely begin with terrible intentions. They started after my business failed. He continued staring at the table. I convinced myself I only needed temporary access. I thought I'd replace everything before anyone noticed. I listened silently. Then the debt became larger. So I moved more. And then more. He swallowed hard. Eventually, I stopped thinking about whether I had permission. I only thought about whether I could fix it later. The room became quiet again. Finally, I asked the question that had haunted me most. Why make me believe I was forgetting? Richard closed his eyes. I never meant to. But every time you questioned something, I was afraid. So I explained, and explained, and explained, until eventually, you stopped questioning. The words hurt more than I expected, because they contained something even more painful than betrayal. They contained truth. He had manipulated my confidence because it made everything else easier. Not through shouting, not through violence, through repetition, through reassurance, through making me doubt myself instead of doubting him. He looked at me. I'm sorry. I know those words don't repair anything. They don't. I also know you'll never forgive me. I thought carefully before answering. I don't know. He looked surprised. I haven't decided whether forgiveness is possible. But I know reconciliation isn't. He nodded slowly. I understand. For the first time in months, there was no argument, no manipulation, no attempt to persuade me. Only two older people acknowledging that the life they had built together had reached its end. When I stood to leave, Richard spoke one final time. Your mother was right. I turned back. About what truth survives longer than signatures. I left without answering. Not because I was angry, because there was nothing left to say. A month later, Emily and I stood together inside my restored family home. Most of the legal process had finally ended. Boxes filled the living room. Family photographs waited to be rehung. Books covered every available surface. It looked wonderfully imperfect, exactly like a home should. Emily carried in the last box from her car. What should we unpack first? I looked around, then smiled. My mother's writing desk. She laughed. I knew you'd say that. Together we placed the old walnut desk beside the front window where morning sunlight poured into the room. Inside its top drawer lay one final gift. Not money, not jewelry, just a handwritten recipe for my mother's famous cinnamon biscuits. At the bottom, she had written one final sentence. A home isn't protected by locked doors. It's protected by people who choose honesty every day. I gently closed the drawer. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the front yard. Inside, sunlight warmed the room. For the first time in what felt like years, the house no longer felt like a place filled with secrets. It felt like home again. The first Christmas after the divorce arrived more quietly than I expected. For nearly 4 decades, I had measured the holidays by routines that never changed. Richard always insisted on buying the tallest tree in the lot, even when it barely fit through the front door. I baked my mother's cinnamon biscuits on Christmas Eve, and Emily hung the same handmade ornaments she had painted in elementary school. Those traditions had survived job changes, illnesses, and the ordinary ups and downs of family life. I wasn't sure they would survive this, yet somehow they did. Only now, they belonged to a different future. Emily arrived at my house early on the Saturday after Thanksgiving, carrying 3 large storage bins filled with decorations. Her 16-year-old son Ethan followed behind her, pretending the boxes weren't heavy, even though I could see him struggling. I've got it, Grandma, he insisted. I laughed. I remember when those boxes were bigger than you. They still feel bigger than me. We spent the afternoon decorating the house, not because everything was perfect, but because life continues asking to be lived even after your heart has been broken. The walnut writing desk stood beneath the front window, exactly where we had placed it weeks earlier. Above it hung a newly framed photograph of my mother smiling in her garden. Every time I passed it, I found myself smiling back. Emily noticed. You talk to her sometimes, don't you? I smiled sheepishly. More often than I admit. I do too. Neither of us found that strange. Grief changes form, but love rarely disappears. Sometimes it simply becomes conversation carried on in quieter ways. That afternoon, while Ethan untangled Christmas lights in the living room, Emily opened one of the lower drawers in the writing desk. Inside rested several neatly folded envelopes. What are these? I looked over her shoulder. Oh, I almost forgot. They were letters I had spent several evenings writing after the court proceedings ended. One to Ethan, one to any future grandchildren I might someday have, one simply titled Family History. Emily looked at me. You're documenting everything. I nodded. I don't ever want anyone to wonder what happened. Or why. She squeezed my shoulder. Grandma would approve. I hope so. One lesson had become painfully clear throughout the past year. Silence protects confusion. Honest records protect families. That realization changed how I thought about inheritance. For most of my life, I assumed inheritance meant houses, jewelry, money, investments. Now I understood something different. The greatest inheritance isn't property, it's clarity, knowing where things belong, knowing why decisions were made, leaving behind truth instead of uncertainty. Several weeks after Christmas preparations began, attorney Margaret Ellis stopped by with final paperwork. The last remaining property transfers had been completed. Every court order had been satisfied. The Jefferson Avenue building once again belonged entirely to the Brooks Family Preservation Trust. Several recovered investment accounts had been consolidated under new management. This time, management that required independent oversight instead of blind trust. Margaret smiled as I signed the final documents. I've added one recommendation. What is it? She pointed toward the last page. If anything ever happens to you, Emily automatically becomes co-trustee. I nodded. I want everything transparent. That's exactly why I suggested it. She gathered her files. I've practiced estate law for nearly 30 years. I wish every family understood what you've learned. I asked quietly, What have I learned? She smiled. Love and accountability are never enemies. You can trust someone and still insist on understanding your own finances. Those words settled deeply inside me. For years, I had believed asking questions somehow demonstrated distrust. Now I knew the opposite. Healthy relationships survive honest questions. Only unhealthy ones fear them. In early January, I received an unexpected letter. The return address belonged to Richard. I stared at the envelope for nearly an hour before opening it. Inside was a single handwritten page. Virginia. There are many things I cannot repair. I accept that. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect another conversation. I only want you to know something I should have admitted long ago. You were never incapable. I simply convinced myself that I knew better. Somewhere along the way, helping became controlling. Then controlling became hiding. Then hiding became lying. By the time I recognized what I had become, I no longer knew how to stop. I am sorry. Not because I lost. Because I lost the woman who trusted me more than anyone else ever had. I hope you find peace. Richard. I folded the letter carefully, then placed it inside one of the desk drawers. Not beside my mother's letters. Those belonged somewhere different. Richard's letter belonged among reminders. Reminders that people are capable of terrible decisions without becoming entirely evil. And reminders that regret often arrives much too late. I never answered. Not because I wished him harm, because every necessary conversation had already happened. Spring arrived with unusual warmth that year. The flower beds my mother and I had planted decades earlier began blooming once again. Yellow daffodils, purple irises, white lilies. Life continued exactly as it always had. Only I had changed. One Saturday morning, several women from church asked whether I would speak to their widows' support group. At first I declined. I'm not much of a public speaker. Emily laughed. You spent 34 years reading stories to classrooms full of children. You'll be fine. She was right. The meeting took place in the church fellowship hall. About 20 women attended. Some had recently lost husbands. Others simply wanted advice about estate planning. I expected questions about legal documents. Instead, the first question came from a woman named Dorothy. How did you know something was wrong? I thought carefully before answering. I didn't. Not at first. So what changed? I stopped apologizing for asking questions. The room grew quiet. Another woman spoke. My husband handles everything. Should I be worried? I smiled gently. Not necessarily. But you should understand everything you own. Not because you expect betrayal, because understanding is part of respecting yourself. For nearly 2 hours we talked about wills, about trusts, about bank accounts, about conversations families often postpone until it's too late. When the meeting ended, several women hugged me. One quietly whispered, I'm going home to organize my paperwork. I smiled. So am I. Driving home that afternoon, I realized something unexpected. The story I had lived through no longer belonged only to me. If sharing it helped even one person avoid years of confusion, then perhaps some good had grown from all the pain. As I pulled into my driveway, the afternoon sun shone across the front porch. The house looked peaceful, strong, steady, just like my mother had always wanted. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and glanced towards the walnut writing desk. For the first time since opening Vault 317, I no longer saw it as a reminder of betrayal. I saw it for what it had always been, a place where truth had patiently waited until I was finally ready to protect it myself. Nearly 2 years have passed since the morning I stood inside First National Bank and watched the steel door of Vault 317 slowly slide open. People often ask me which moment changed my life the most. Was it discovering my mother's letter? Hearing her voice on that old cassette tape? Watching the judge rule in my favor? Learning that Richard had moved money through a company I never knew existed? Those moments mattered, every one of them. But none of them changed me as deeply as one quiet realization that arrived much later. The greatest thing my mother left behind was never inside the vault. It was the confidence to trust myself again. For months after the legal case ended, I still found myself questioning ordinary decisions. I'd sign a check, then look at it twice. I'd organize a folder, then wonder whether I had placed everything in the correct order. Years of being gently persuaded that someone else always knew better had left marks that couldn't be erased overnight. Healing wasn't dramatic, it was ordinary. And perhaps that's why it was so powerful. Every morning I made one small decision for myself. Sometimes it was as simple as choosing where to have breakfast. Sometimes it meant reviewing every bank statement that arrived in the mail. Sometimes it meant asking questions without apologizing first. Little by little, confidence returned. Not because someone gave it back to me, because I practiced using it again. Emily noticed before I did. One afternoon, we were sitting on my front porch watching Ethan wash his first car. He had just earned his driver's license and treated that old pickup truck as though it were a priceless collector's item. Emily smiled. "You've changed." I laughed. "I certainly have." "No, I mean something different." She looked at me carefully. "You don't ask permission anymore." I hadn't realized she was right. For years, nearly every sentence I spoke had quietly carried uncertainty. "Do you think? Maybe. If it's okay?" Now I simply said what I believed. Not arrogantly, not stubbornly, just honestly. That small change felt enormous. Later that summer, Ethan asked if I would help him prepare for college. He wanted to study accounting. I couldn't help laughing at the irony. "You picked the one subject Grandma never understood," he grinned. "Maybe. But Mom says understanding money protects people." I smiled. "Your mother is very wise." He looked thoughtful. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Were you angry at Grandpa?" Children have a way of asking the hardest questions with the greatest sincerity. I thought carefully before answering. "I was. For a long time." "Are you still?" I looked toward the garden where my mother's roses continued blooming each spring. "No, not anymore." "Why not?" "Because carrying anger every day means letting yesterday keep deciding how today feels." He nodded slowly. "So you forgave him?" Another difficult question. I chose not to hate him. Forgiveness is something quieter. It's letting go of the need to keep reliving the pain. I don't know whether everyone reaches that place. I only know I wanted peace more than I wanted bitterness. Ethan considered that for a long time. Finally, he smiled. "I think Grandma Eleanor would like that answer." "So do I." A few months later, I received another unexpected letter. Not from Richard, from Thomas. Inside was a short, handwritten note. "Virginia, I wanted you to know that I resigned from Riverside Heritage Holdings the day investigators contacted me. I cooperated completely because I finally realized that remaining silent was another form of dishonesty. Thank you for showing me that truth matters more than family pride. I wish I had understood that sooner. Thomas." I folded the letter and placed it beside Richard's. Not because they belonged together, but because both represented something important. People can choose differently once they finally face the truth. Some choices come too late. They still matter. The following spring, Emily surprised me with a gift. She handed me a leather-bound binder. Across the cover, she had embossed 3 words in gold: the Coleman Family Archive. Inside were copies of every important family document: trust papers, property records, letters, photographs, recipes, military records, birth certificates. Every section included clear explanations written in plain English. No confusing legal language, no hidden folders, no unanswered questions. At the very front, she had inserted one page titled Grandma Eleanor's Principles. She had listed 5 simple sentences gathered from my mother's journals. Tell the truth, even when it's inconvenient. Read before you sign. Questions are not disrespect. Protect people with honesty, not secrecy. Leave clarity as your greatest inheritance. I cried when I read them. Not from sadness, from gratitude. Our family's story would no longer disappear into forgotten filing cabinets. It would remain open, understandable, available to every generation that followed. Last month, I visited Vault 317 one final time. Not because I needed anything, only because I wanted to close that chapter myself. David Foster, now preparing for retirement, greeted me warmly. I had a feeling you'd come back someday. I wanted to say goodbye. He unlocked the secure room. Together we stood before the familiar compartment. This time there were no arguments, no attorneys, no fear, only quiet. I looked at the empty space where my mother's carefully preserved originals had rested before being transferred into the family trust's permanent archive. It's strange, I said. I used to think this vault held my inheritance. David smiled. What do you think now? I looked around the room. I think it held my mother's faith. Faith that one day I would be strong enough to face the truth. He nodded. I believe she'd be very proud. As I walked out of the bank, sunlight spilled across the front steps. People hurried past, carrying briefcases, grocery bags, and coffee cups. Everyone seemed busy living ordinary lives. For a long time, I believed ordinary was something to take for granted. Now I understood better. Ordinary mornings, honest conversations, signing your own name with confidence, knowing where your family papers are kept, laughing with your daughter over coffee, watching your grandson chase his future. Those ordinary moments are extraordinary gifts. If you've spent years believing your voice doesn't matter, let me tell you something my mother spent a lifetime trying to teach me. Your kindness should never require your silence. Your trust should never require your blindness. And love, real love, never asks you to surrender your right to understand your own life. Vault 317 didn't simply protect my family's documents. It protected the woman I had forgotten I could still become. In the end, the greatest inheritance wasn't money. It was the courage to believe myself again. The hardest betrayals are rarely committed by strangers. They come from the people we love most, the people we trust enough to stop asking questions. That is what makes them so painful. But if there is one lesson I hope you take away from my story, it is this: trusting someone should never require you to lose trust in yourself. Love is built on honesty, not secrecy. A healthy marriage, a healthy family, and a healthy relationship should never make you feel ashamed for asking questions or wanting to understand your own life. I also learned that strength doesn't always look like fighting. Sometimes strength is quietly gathering the truth, refusing to panic, and allowing patience to do what anger never could. My mother didn't leave me a fortune because she believed money would save me. She left me wisdom, preparation, and the courage to stand on the truth when my own confidence had been shaken. In the end, those gifts were worth far more than any inheritance. If you've ever been made to feel that your voice didn't matter, that your opinions were too emotional, or that someone else should handle everything because it's easier, I hope you'll remember this. Your questions are not a sign of distrust, they are a sign of self-respect. Know what you own, read what you sign, protect your future with knowledge as well as kindness. Being compassionate and being informed can exist together, and neither one diminishes the other. Most importantly, don't let someone else's mistakes convince you that your life is over. Healing is possible, peace is possible, and sometimes the most beautiful chapter of your life begins only after you finally discover the truth. No matter your age, it is never too late to reclaim your confidence, rebuild your future, and become the person you were always meant to be. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment when the truth completely changed your life? Or have you ever had to rebuild your confidence after someone betrayed your trust? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Your story may encourage someone else who needs hope today. And if you enjoy heartfelt family dramas with meaningful life lessons and inspiring endings, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for spending your time with me, and wherever you are in the world, I hope you stay safe, cherish the people who earn your trust, and never stop believing in